Unit 4, Lesson 2, Causes of the Great Depression. Our lesson objective is that students will be able to understand the economic and political causes of the Great Depression. Our essential question for the day, why was there a Great Depression in the United States? Unit 4, Lesson 2, Vocabulary. Economic growth and output during the 1920s grew 42%. During that time, the United States produced 50% of the world's output, or 50% of the world's manufactured goods. New construction rose from 6.7 billion in 1920 to 12 billion in 1926. The unemployment rate in the 1920s never rose above the natural rate of around 4%. And per capita GDP, or gross domestic product, rose from 6,460 to over $8,000 per person during this time. Also, in 1920, the top 1% of the population received approximately 13.4% of total income. By 1929, it increased to 14.5% of total income in the United States. The 1920s served as the beginning of the modern era of U.S. economics, which saw a rapid rise in prosperity and technology. Those sweeping changes we've covered in society and the economy, like the electricity boom, which revolutionized our way of life, and the transportation and communication improvements that made it easier for Americans to travel and communicate with one another over great distances. The focus and emphasis on personal beauty and entertainment and housekeeping and other achievements and revolutions in and outside of the home led to this rise in prosperity, which gave rise to new ideas and new ways of thought. We also talked about the voting changes and how women were seeking the rights to vote and more independence. Well, the 1920s also saw a process of stock manipulations start to become prevalent. One of those manipulations was known as buying on margin. This was a financial innovation that allowed exuberant investment in the stock market, which supported rapid growth for many companies and the labor sector. That same exuberance led to asset bubbles and an overheated economy. An economic bubble that eventually burst in 1929, signaling the beginning of the Great Depression of the 1930s. One reason for the boom of the 1920s was because of those financial innovations. Like stockbrokers began allowing customers to buy stocks on margin. This is when investors only needed to put down 10 or 20% of the price of a stock, and brokers would lend them the remaining 80 to 90%. Buying on margin enabled investors to purchase more stock than they could previously afford if they had to purchase it for the entire price. This allowed stockholders to realize higher gains if the stock price went up, but it became a significant weakness when stock prices fell. But why was buying on margin a problem? It was a problem because you can lose much more money than you initially invested. A decline of 50% or more from stocks that were half funded using borrowed funds equates to a loss of 100% or more in your portfolio, plus the interest and commissions you have to make on each of the stock shares and trades, purchases and sell-offs. Buying on margin was a very risky maneuver that could pay high dividends or high profit margins for an individual, but more likely left them with crushing debt. During the 1920s, banking began to be a major problem. With the laissez-faire economic policies of Presidents Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, only one-third of the nation's 24,000 banks belonged to the Federal Reserve System, where there was very little government oversight and protection on individual banks. And non-member banks relied on each other to hold reserves. This was major weakness number one, which meant these banks were vulnerable to bank runs that occurred in the early 1930s. The major weakness number two was that banks held fictitious reserves. Checks were counted as reserves before they cleared. As a result, these checks were double counted by the sending bank and the receiving bank. Banks were taking credit for funds that they didn't have access to. Banks were taking credit for money that wasn't deposited into their bank. So when customers went to withdraw their money, the bank artificially looked like it had a lot of money in its reserves, but in reality, it had less than half of what they claimed to have. What exactly were bank runs, you ask? Banking panics or bank runs during the Great Depression were when large numbers of anxious people withdrew their deposits and savings in cash. This forced banks to liquidate loans, and it led to many of the bank failures of the 1920s and early 1930s. These improper banking practices and manipulation of the stock market came to a halt on October 29, 1929. The day of the stock market crash became known as Black Tuesday around the world. This is when stocks began to drop to their true worth. People panicked and sold their stocks for less than they paid. This caused the stock prices to drop rapidly, sending America into the Great Depression and financially ruining a large percentage of Americans. Black Tuesday, as you can see from this New York newspaper headline, and the stock market crash of 1929 signaled the end of a period of post-World War I economic expansion and the beginning of the Great Depression, which lasted until the beginning of World War II. The stock market lost 12% of its value on Black Tuesday alone.